I see that people are still signing on, but we'll just take a couple of minutes to sort of reintroduce the session. Welcome to day 4 of our Pali COVID series. And today's session, like I mentioned yesterday, is a very important one. It's on end of life care and bereavement. Just to quickly recap on where we are at the moment. On day 1, we covered triage, ethical decision making, and goals of care. And that's when we met Ramesh, who's been our protagonist, and we met his family. We experienced with him some of the anxieties and uncertainties of embarking on a journey that I think a lot of people around the world now are embarking on. We talked about how, given his comorbidities and other circumstances, what would be uh, the goals of care that would be ideal for someone like Ramesh, as difficult as the circumstances might be. We went through that journey with him. On day 2, we explored some of the symptoms that he was developing, and as they deteriorated, would be um, what would be better in terms of excellent symptom control versus ventilation. We went through some of those decisions and arrived at the fact that perhaps in his case, symptom control is what can be done. And yesterday we talked about communication and how important communication as a skill is right across the trajectory of illness, from the time somebody is diagnosed to well after bereavement, and even within our own settings as healthcare providers, how essential communication skills are in order for us to be able to navigate a very difficult time. So that's where we're at, and today we're going to be talking about end of life care. And you are familiar with our two facilitators. Our lead facilitator is Dr. Roop Gursahani, and and of course Dr. Rajam Iyer will be co-facilitating with him. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Dr. Jennifer, who is going to join in as another co-facilitator, and she's with with CMC Vellore, with many years of experience in palliative care. So I'm very glad to hand over to the three of you. Rajam, am I handing to you first or straight up to Roop?
Roop will start, yeah.
Dr. Roop, all yours. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Yes, here we are. Yeah. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I mean, I know some of you are from outside India as well, and it's always a pleasure to interact with people from other countries and cultures. And let me begin by thanking the author of this presentation, who has put together the presentation for us. Rajam, do you mind taking on for just a minute, please?
Sure.
I'm
So,
just coming. Yeah.
sure. So, good afternoon, everybody. Like Smriti said, yesterday we spoke about communications. Today we are going to talk about a very important aspect of end of life care. And just to start, as in wait for Dr. Roop, we wanted to just take in some of your thoughts of in the pandemic, how many of you actually deal with end of life care with patients with COVID, or your experiences, if you all can put in the chat box, of how all of you are dealing with your non-COVID patients at the end of life, or has it been a struggle during the COVID times to look after your patients at end of life? And can you just please put some thoughts of what challenges you all are facing, or what you think as a group is exact meaning and understanding of end of life? So, and then we can take those discussions forward along with Ramesh and his family, and discuss with you what we think is important for a person towards end of life. It will be nice if you can just in your chat box put some thoughts of the struggles all of you have had during the pandemic for both your COVID and non-COVID patients. And also if you could think of what exactly end of life means to all of you. While we wait for Dr. Roop, we can just get these discussions starting. Anybody has some thoughts or experiences during the pandemic, or has it changed the end of life management for all of you? Or what is end of life? How do you all think about it? As how do you all define end of life? So thank you, Marianne, for responding.
Okay.
Yeah, 1 second, Roop, I'll just finish this point and go.
Yeah.
One challenge I've encountered is giving the wish of a hospice patient to go back home. Oh, very, very poignant. Couldn't go back home because of the pandemic. And Priyanka is checking it. Okay, thank you, Marianne, for responding. Over to Dr. Roop. He's come back, so he'll start the talk for today.
Yeah, sorry guys. I forgot I hadn't turned the AC on and it was beginning to bake inside here. So let me begin by thanking Dr. Rajashri, who's put together these slides. And Rajam has already told you some part of how we plan to run this session. So I will be stopping for discussion in between, and it's good if you people have connected on the chat and shared your thoughts, because I will not be able to pay too much attention to the chat. My co-facilitators, Dr. Rajam and Dr. Jennifer, will do that, and they will be connecting with you on the chat. So this is a little bit of like multitasking. We have multi-learning going on. Right. So we've just been introduced to Mr. Ramesh. We've already been with him for 2 days. And you know that he tested positive, came into the COVID care center, and his general condition has worsened. And there is a bit of a change in the sense that there was an option of put him on mechanical ventilation, but he was not actually. So this slide is a little incorrect. He was not put on mechanical ventilation, and he's still in the outside unit. And his has worsened over the past 2 days. Now, when you begin to deal with this issue, you have to take into account uh, these various terms that you have probably heard in parts. The first term is ethics, and the first question is of autonomy. And autonomy means, especially in this situation, had Mr. Ramesh ever expressed any thoughts about this? Because as of now, he's not fully in his senses. It's not difficult. It is a little difficult to communicate with him. So the family needs to tell us what he would have wished, because they are the people who know him best, and they are the people who can tell us what kind of person was he, what would he have wanted. The second is actually beneficence and non-maleficence. Beneficence means doing good, non-maleficence means not doing harm. We usually run them together, and you need to look at this in terms of Mr. Ramesh himself. Are you going to be doing good to him by doing whatever you are planning to do? For instance, if Mr. Ramesh is kept in the general ward, and if he's managed there, if his symptoms are well taken care of, if he is comfortable, are you doing bad? On the contrary, if you take him into the ICU, you put him on the ventilator, together with the pain and the trauma of being intubated, he's away from his family because he needs to be sedated. They cannot at all communicate with him. And it is quite likely, given his medical condition, and I can tell you this from my position as a neurologist, that it is extremely unlikely that Mr. Ramesh will come out of this in the same state that he went into it, which means that if he was, as it is, somebody who was dependent, then after this, he will be very likely completely bedridden. And that too, if he survives, because survival for a patient like him after ventilation is probably in the range of 10 to 20%. So, but the third question that you need to consider, and that is justice, and that is something that we are all a little uncomfortable with. It really depends on the situation you are on. If you are running a public facility where the need for your beds is far more than the beds that you have, then the fact that Ramesh, who most likely will not benefit, occupies an ICU bed and a ventilator means that another individual who might benefit will not get it. So that is where it is important for you to put ethics into this consideration. And then comes foreseeing and foretelling. So as a physician, what I have told you, the scenarios that I have outlined, if he gets ventilated, then there's only a 20% chance of survival and an 80% chance of mortality. Within that 20% survival, it is extremely likely that if at all he comes out, he will be completely bedridden, he will have a tracheostomy, he will have a feeding tube, and most likely a catheter in place for the remainder of his life until he passes away. So you are able to foresee this. The family has never had this kind of an experience before. So it is your duty to foresee and to foretell. So foresee came in the first session. Foretelling came yesterday, because how you convey this information is extremely important. But if you do not commit to foretelling, then please understand that over a period of time, your foresight, your ability to see ahead also becomes poorer. So you must commit to foretelling. And then comes a question of withholding and withdrawing. We will discuss this a little further in detail a little later, but this is important because for families, for all of us, not doing something from the beginning, although it may seem difficult when we look at it, is actually in the long run easier. Once Ramesh is on the ventilator, the decision to take him off the ventilator is going to be far more challenging, not just for the family, but actually even for the treating team. And that is why, if you look at it, our management of Ramesh has, in a sense, paid a great deal of emphasis to withholding. So if you do this, you must begin by understanding that death is actually a natural event. Life, death. This is something that we have to accept. We are not hastening it. We are not bringing it on earlier. We are just accepting that this is one more of these features of our biology. You learn the importance of end-of-life care and how do you apply it in the specific problems that COVID-19 has thrown to us. You highlight these principles and understand the strategies. And if you have not read it, you will get all of this in the ebook. You can also download an app which gives you tips for symptom control in these and other patients. There are quotes from many thinkers, and the quote that I usually use is from somebody who quipped about it, and his quip was that I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when my death happens. And that is the way we all look at it. But unfortunately, that is not the way it is. And death is something that we as healthcare professionals have to be there to help our patients and families through. And that is why you begin this by understanding your own attitudes towards this. Very often you find that those amongst us who are not willing to think of our own deaths, uh, think of what will happen when we die, and so on, are the ones who are most uncomfortable discussing this with our patients. In Tibetan Buddhism, meditating on one's own death is an essential practice. And just think about this. What is it that stirs your mind? What sort of death do you prefer? Where would you like to have it? Who do you want to be with you? And then comes the question of, are you bothered about how others die? So what I suggest is, what stirs your mind, what sort of death, where, and who do you want? These are 4 questions. It would be nice if you don't have to answer all of them, at least one of them. Please put in 1 or 2 words on the chat box for Dr. Rajam to have a look at. Dr. Rajam and Dr. Jennifer to have a look at. Right. So, as I said earlier, Ramesh's condition has deteriorated further, and we have begun to aim at good end-of-life care. And the medical team has called a video conference. Now, you can do it on WhatsApp, you can do it on Zoom, but throughout this pandemic, we've all gotten used to communicating electronically. And actually, the family said, can we just take him home? Because it turned up in the discussion that Ramesh at some stage had said that I don't want my last days to be in an ICU. And in that sense, as we begin to move on this journey with him, we realize that we are actually following his wishes in not taking him to the ICU. But how do we ensure good quality end-of-life care? Yeah, Rajam, you'll take it.
The chat box is still, nobody has responded, but I just wanted to highlight when in the beginning, I did ask them whether they faced any challenges during this COVID pandemic about end-of-life care of their patients and what end-of-life actually meant to them also. And one of the doctors mentioned how for the non-COVID patients, it was not easy to fulfill one of the last wishes of going home. So obviously this pandemic has thrown the balance of the whole lot of us, and it's kind of affected all of us, even if it's not directly, but indirectly, there's been a lot of challenge to deliver good quality end of life. That was one of the points brought out by the early one of the chat's points.
Right. So anyway, so this question still stays, and anybody who's still wants to add, they can go on. I mean, they can add it while we go on to the next part of it. Now, why is end-of-life care? Why do we focus so much on this? For those of us who are from India, it may be a little, you may not be aware of this bit of literature, but some time ago, in 2010 and then in 2015, there was a study which looked at quality of death, which means how well do people die in different countries across the world. This bar chart is from 2015, and in that India is 13th from the bottom, which was actually a little bit of an improvement, because in the earlier one in 2010, out of 40 we were last. Okay, so we improved because they found 13 countries that are actually worse than us. So why and what determines quality of death? The first is, of course, whether you are able to give them palliative care towards the end of life. Obviously, the healthcare environment has to be able to take care of all of this. So you have to have human resources. You have to have people who are trained in delivering palliative care. And one of the efforts of this has to be to make all of you who are attending understand the basics of what it is that we do as palliative care physicians. Of course, this care has to be affordable. There has to be good quality throughout it. And what we realize is that humans are not meant to live and die alone. So it's important that the community around them, not just the family, but the community around them also is engaged. And all of this, if this is done together, if a country has, and as of now, in India, it is possible really to a large extent only in Kerala that most of this is attended to. And I can tell it to you from personal experience that a villager in Kerala dies better than a rich man in Mumbai, generally.
We've had some very important themes come out regarding end of life.
Okay.
Words like grace, peace, comfort, dignity. So those are important to highlight when it comes to end of life.
Yes, go ahead, Jennifer. You want to speak on that?
Yeah, we've had some good responses come when we think about end of life. So people have highlighted important themes like grace, peace, comfort, and dignity, which they would prefer around their own death. And this is what we think of as well when we think about our patients.
Yeah. So, Rajam, anything?
That's it. And I think Dr. Nikhil has said how he was scared about for his elderly parents, but now the fear has decreased, and he also has written about peaceful death, about receiving religious sacraments, was also commented upon by somebody, peaceful and pain-free. So I just asked them whether, I mean, it's the same for all of us, and how much do we manage to give the same to our patients? So that is something that we need to think through this session.
That statement about peace was very, very important. It has been identified as the one single question that you can ask a patient. Of course, Ramesh is not in a state where we can ask this, but in somebody who is conscious and where things have been attended to, a simple question is, are you at peace? Towards the end of life, that is a question that will open up a whole discussion if it is possible. But it is like a bellwether question. It tests the spiritual state of that patient. Okay. So now we are moving on to how to manage end of life care in the context of COVID-19. If you remember, there were one specific issues with COVID-19, which, well, even as palliative care physicians, we are not geared for. It's an acute illness. So there is less time for preparedness. There is limited information. Of course, now, say almost about 4 months plus, there's much more information about how these things will work out. So if you see certain biochemical indicators and so on, then you know that these are poor prognostic factors. On the flip side, the family is being bombarded with information on social media. So there is a high level of anxiety from this. For the patient, isolation, I mean, again, in some ways, if Ramesh is not fully conscious, that in some ways is a blessing, because that isolation itself produces grief on both sides. For us as doctors, how do you smile at a patient when you got a mask on? And when you have full PPE, do they know who's there? Is it a robot? Is it a human? How do you know that? So, and if you add artificial life support measures, which are probably not going to, or most likely are not going to help the patient, then you actually add to the suffering. So that is why it becomes important to do what we specified in the first part. And that is that the medical team, the people taking care of the patient, should make a point of avoiding futile or inappropriate management. And inappropriate management is, I would say, almost a disease by itself. So if you do this, you are in fact, it cannot, in a patient who's got a terminal illness, it is by no means considered intention to kill. So we do not any longer use the term euthanasia, because when we say euthanasia, it is not passive, it is actually killing somebody. Here we are withholding or withdrawing a treatment which we know as medical professionals was unlikely to work in that given patient at that time. And that is why this cannot be construed as an intention to kill. So what you do is you change And this is a pivot that has to occur in our minds. For us, throughout our medical careers, our focus has been on cure. Okay. And you pivot from cure to care. And that is a pivot that you have to actually think in your own mind, that you are not giving up on the patient, but you are changing from focusing on cure to focusing on care. And how do you do this? By refocusing the medical and nursing care to give comfort, by avoiding unnecessary interventions, and reviewing all medicines and symptoms regularly. So unnecessary medicines are a burden, they must be taken off. Symptoms that are troublesome must be controlled. Throughout this, there has to be effective communication. And remember that during this period, the family is undergoing a huge amount of distress, and you must provide psychosocial support.
So one point, Roop, just before you go on, there's an interesting discussion on the chat as to how different parts of the world are actually trying to help patients during end of life. So Marianne says they call the chaplain in with the PPE and try to support the patient end of life. For the family, it's with video call. Some people prefer to die at home, but in COVID conditions, that's not possible. So, there's some interesting points about how it is important to deliver our palliative care approach in end of life, even in these challenging times. And there's a request saying, I hope they allow family members to come in with PPE and say their last bye to patients. So some interesting points, which maybe you could take it up later. Otherwise, PPE, when they have died already, hard for the families not to see their loved ones and just take them in urns. It must be very, very hard, which I'm sure we'll touch about it later. But very interesting discussions amongst the participants, saying what all the family goes through, what the patient goes through, and how small gestures by the hospital admin, doctors, the healthcare professional team can make a big difference. And with PPE, Nikhil is mentioning that the challenge is the doffing is not a technique easy to teach them for that 1 or 2 10 minutes that they spend. So it might be a challenge. So Nikhil is saying we're planning to make a glass window so that they at least see them from afar.
Yeah, so I remember on my Twitter, there was this picture of this Palestinian man. I'm sure other people may have also seen it. His mother was in the room inside, and he was sitting on the window outside. He sat there for 48 hours until she passed away. Okay, so now you move on to planning. Now, when you do this planning, the most important is the goals of care discussion. Ideally, goals of care discussion should be held with the patient. But if the patient is not able to participate in this discussion, then you ask the family about the patient and what the patient would have wanted. So it's important to focus the family on understanding that they are speaking for the patient. We try to emphasize to them that yes, they do want him back. They have, as individuals, they have their own wants and needs. But here the concern is the patient's wants and needs if they were expressed. So we have to tell the family that you are here to speak as his voice or her voice. And although your emotional needs are also there and we will address them, we want to hear his voice as much as it is possible to do. Once we have the goals of care have been sorted out between the family and the treating team. And remember, when this has to be done, the treating team has to be in consensus. It cannot be that the intensivist says one thing, the respiratory physician says another thing, the physician says a third one, and the nurse on the spot says a fourth thing. So ideally, everybody should be on the same page. And with that, we have a goals of care discussion. And during that, with consensus, we transit from intensive care to a palliative care approach. Ideally, the palliative care team, if there is a team, should be involved during this discussion itself. So it should not appear that it's almost as though you put the patient directly into their care. No, they are involved in the discussion. And Rajam and I work together in Hinduja Hospital, and she comes into the ICU when it is needed for her, when this discussion begins. So that as the patient moves to her care more than ours, she is part of the team itself. And with this, you give the family also psychosocial support, extending to after the exit of Ramesh. So this plan has to be cleared between the treating team, and the family also should be aware of it. Now, you have already been told about strategies for effective end-of-life care symptom management day before yesterday by Dr. Rajam. And you remember that the common symptoms are breathlessness, agitation, pain, fever, secretions. So a lot of secretions and difficult to cough, and it can be quite a problem even for anybody to hear it, and obviously prevent pressure injuries. While managing all of these, we all need to have adequate PPE. For breathlessness, we have already discussed this. Morphine and benzodiazepine both can be used. When I say benzodiazepine, I mean midazolam. Typically, that's a drug that we use, though others can be used if you don't have midazolam. And morphine, obviously. The doses, in case you wish to, you can always access this from the ebook, but here it is: 5 milligrams subcutaneously or 2.5 milligrams IV, together with the midazolam. Give every 15 to 30 minutes until the symptoms improve, and then you go on to a continuous infusion, if it is indicated, of morphine, 30 milligrams, and midazolam, both together over a period of 24 hours. If the patient is agitated and very restless, then haloperidol can be given both as a stat dose and a continuous infusion. For the continuous infusion, we recommend 20 milligrams of haloperidol and 30 mg of midazolam in a continuous either IV or subcutaneous infusion over 24 hours. Pain and fever, paracetamol is the best, and we don't use it enough. We prefer to use all kinds of other ones. It's paracetamol that works best. And remember that you can go up to a maximum of 4 grams per 24 hours. If the patient is already on opioids, you continue according to the response. And if you do need to do a pain assessment here, you may not be able to rely on verbal responses. Are you in pain or not in pain? You will also have to look at grimacing, withdrawing, and such other non-verbal indicators. Of course, you have to modify the doses depending on the renal function, because as things progress, it's quite possible that renal function may begin to drop. Now, secretions are important to understand, because when the secretions are relatively thin, they produce a lot of noise, and this can be distressing. Of course, it is distressing to the patient, but anybody hearing it also finds it extremely uncomfortable. So we prefer to avoid suction, because suction is traumatic. You do a position change, and anti-sialagogues, meaning drugs that reduce saliva, can be used. Of this, glycopyrrolate, 200 to 400 micrograms every 4 hours, IV or subcutaneous, is probably the most useful. If not, the simplest option that you can get almost anywhere is atropine, 1% ophthalmic solution. Just put 1 or 2 drops in the mouth, and it works very well. Of course, if you make the secretions too thick, then that also makes things difficult, because then they start to choke on them. And very dry mouth also is difficult for the patient. Pressure areas have to be taken care of. And remember, there are pressure areas are not just on the visible sacral areas. It could even be where the endotracheal tube is exiting from the mouth. or the nasogastric tube from the nostril, or from the masks. Preferably use a pressure reducing air mattress, but if that is not possible, at least turning and moving has to be done. Soiling has to be avoided. The pressure points should be gently massaged and moisturized. And turning sometimes can be, or often can be, painful. And when that happens, very rigid turning regimes also, I mean, you need to be a little careful about that. So I'm going to again stop and
Dr. Jennifer has put a very important point, saying suction might be best avoided because of the increased risk of spread. And she's also asking the participants if they have come across any difficult symptoms, symptom management during the end of life or in COVID patients that they would like to share. So suction, I think it's a very important point in the given this thing that it's an aerosol spread infection, probably best to avoid, and we really need to it's probably a good idea to hang on to these medications that you can give for controlling quantity of secretions. So Dr. Momina has said that sometimes COVID patients suffer from severe respiratory distress and restless at the end of life. So is there any role of palliative sedation for that patient? So I can take that question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Or Dr. Jennifer also, for that matter.
Yes.
So palliative sedation, yes, definitely has a role in patients who have distressing breathlessness towards the end of life. What palliative sedation, again, aims to do is clearly only comfort the patient, not to hasten death. So communication with the family and documentation of their wishes is extremely important, because most patients, all patients after palliative sedation will be unresponsive. So it's important to establish that fact with the family. And again, the doses that Dr. Roop already mentioned in the past, to be given 24-hourly, maybe in a syringe drive or through a subcutaneous route. You could use morphine in combination with midazolam and haloperidol if there's agitation for palliative sedation. It's just that it's another form of controlling these distressing symptoms. So it can be safely used if communicated and documented correctly. Thank you, Dr. Momina.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Jennifer, you want to add something?
Yes, Dr. Rajam has discussed the key important points. Before deciding it is palliative sedation, you need to be very sure you've tried out adequate symptom management, and the patient is actually at end of life. So you should be sure that you've considered reversible causes, you have tried standard symptom management, both non-pharmacologically and pharmacologically, before you resort to palliative sedation. And communication is the key. Thank you.
And Dr. Moira has also added, saying that we must be clear about the use of sedation for symptoms versus the term palliative care sedation. The latter is seldom needed, if ever, if the former symptom control intervention is done well, which is also correct. So it's a gray line between symptom control and palliative sedation. So that needs to be sorted. Nikhil has pointed out that secretions and tachycardia, especially when we are using the technique of prone ventilation, has been his issues, because repeated tube movements and adjustments are there. Yes, thank you, Nikhil. This has been a challenge during this pandemic because of the prone ventilation, and it's highly resource. You require a lot of resources, the amount of times people needed to turn the patient and maintain the prone position. So yes, that has been a challenge, and therefore, and since suction also is a challenge during this pandemic, use of these medications like hyoscine or glycopyrrolate or atropine may actually be beneficial, because doing suction is also dangerous in these positions.
Rajam, can I just, just a quick comment. I think I would just very much back up what Jennifer said. I don't think it is a gray area. I think symptom control is what we need, exactly what Jennifer was saying. I think palliative sedation is a term which has become quite confusing, as opposed to sedation for symptoms in palliative care. So I totally agree with Jennifer. I don't think we should even use the term. I think we should just say if someone is agitated, we use medications to symptom control that, to do that. We use opiates, we use benzodiazepines, but we should not get into, and certainly not non-specialists, into what's called palliative sedation. So let's just be really clear on that one, because it's caused a lot of confusion in the international literature, and I can even see it causing some confusion here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. So just reiterating the point that if at all by this stage, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, very much.
Okay. Yeah. So by this stage, you will have understood that in more complex cases, you do need palliative care specialists to be involved. So Ramesh has deteriorated further, and we are all agreed that the aim is good end of life care, meaning the family is agreed, the treating team is agreed. But the family now comes up with another question. They say, can we just take him home? He had always wanted to be at home at the end of his life. And this is a challenge. Even otherwise, it is a challenge because you have to ensure good quality end of life care outside the institution, which is not very easy. What about the local authorities' directives about caring for COVID positive patients at home? Now, it is okay to take care of patients who are asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, where they can look after themselves. But anybody who requires other people to take care of them, almost nowhere is it permitted to do this at home because the risk of contamination is too high. So you cannot give care, you cannot maintain, avoid contamination. And have they even thought about how their neighbors will react? So you go through all of this. So there is caring for the patient, disinfecting, disposing waste, all the protocols that even in our hospitals took some time to set up. If you remember, I don't know if, it was just about 3 or 4 months ago that we were all busy trying to figure out how to do all of this. So how do you transfer that expertise home? And then there is no professional support. How does anybody know how to use medicines or medical gadgets? Will there be enough PPEs there? And obviously there is the fear of contagion, the high level of anxiety in the family, and stigma from society. That is something that the family may not have thought about when they bring these issues up, and it is your job to point this out. Right. But in other situations, yes, it can be done by appropriate training of family members and so on. But in this situation, although perhaps you could have strategies put in place, such as disinfecting, disposal of waste material, self-care, and so on, we feel that in general, it is extremely difficult. But we have perspectives from elsewhere in the world. I think in one of the earlier sessions, Moira had brought in some changes that are occurring. Does anybody want to add to that? Rajam, Jennifer? How about managing a patient with COVID towards the end of life at home? A little bit of discussion. Hello.
So I think there was a comment from one of the participants saying that in her part of the world, COVID patients cannot be sent home. Even positive patients have to be in a facility. So the whole focus is hospital management for COVID patients strictly, and also the fact that even in that particular country, she insists, was saying that even the positive patients are put in facility. However, I think that's not there in India because of the volume of population. And there are some participants like Nikhil and Marianne who have said that wish the protocols and guidelines are also incorporating comfort care and not just containment and detection of more patients. And they have also commented that these guidelines should be given by medical experts and not non-medical people or bureaucrats. Then maybe the system will be fine. So there are some suggestions about and ethical principles also that come into place when there are COVID positive patients. So it's difficult to send these patients home, even if the patients want to be sent home.
Okay, so one thing
Moira has a point here.
Yes, please. Moira,
so maybe Moira, why don't you She said,
there you are.
I think, Jennifer, you can see what I said. I think it's very, very interesting. Watch this space. What's happening in Delhi, where they were going to commission railway carriages for care? I think this is what's happening. People are choosing areas for care, which may not be, strictly speaking, home, but are designated non-intensive care options. But in the UK, it was common to discharge, but that's because you've got good primary care. It's much more challenging when you don't have good primary care.
I also think just another point here, Moira, is for non-intensive care, we were struggling to find doctors to fill in our intensive care. So the lack of professionals to look after these patients in the non-intensive became a challenge. So you needed to have medical personnel to see the transition between them going home and them going to intensive care. So I think we've had this paucity of doctors in this country too. So probably one of the reasons why it was better that they were monitored at home and then they got to hospital.
Yeah,
Just a thought.
But if you're looking at the end of life, sorry, go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry, can I just add? I think we need to keep in mind it's a very complex situation we are in, with multiple factors coming into play. And even considering just a single country, India, each state is so different in terms of its healthcare availability, resources in terms of medical professionals. And it's hard to come across a single protocol that will work
everywhere
throughout the country or even across countries. And fortunately or unfortunately, these are played by people who know the system completely or not. And we are kind of constrained with what we can do. But I see your good heart behind this, and what comes at your door is what you can do. So please don't try to carry the whole burden yourself, but do what you can, and I think that will be the best.
Yeah. So, but there is one issue that comes up again and again, and this is something that people are beginning to understand, that dying of COVID, not only is it likely to be lonely, but if it is, for instance, if it occurs at home, then the whole process of the formalities of death, the death certificate, the preparation of the body, all of those are issues that families are unlikely to be prepared for. At the same time, they also are unwilling to accept the idea that they will not be there at the end. And this is something that will come to you around you, because you will have, I've had this situation of an elderly neighbor where the son just did not want to do the COVID test, because if the COVID test comes positive, the old man is moved into a facility. And if he's moved into a facility, not only is he incapable of taking care of himself, but the son knows that he will not be there at the end. So communication is important. The levels of distress are high. The barriers to communication are many, but we can explore their concerns. We can use techniques of active listening. So when these dilemmas come up, people don't expect you to give them a solution. They know that these dilemmas, we too have them, but just hear them. They once they know that people share these dilemmas, it's important. Information sharing, acknowledging reactions, and empathy. All of these are strategies for effective communication. For the family, grief is complicated. I had a patient who had severe migraines 2 months later because her elder sister passed away in the beginning of April due to COVID, and she said, I couldn't see her. So families go through complicated grief. There may be complicated grief partly because they may feel responsible. Did I give that infection to Ramesh? Throughout this period, we have a cultural way of handling grief where the community, the wider family, comes in to help the stricken near and dear ones. Quarantine stops that. There is stigma from society. So please remember that bereavement support can also be electronic. And as far as possible, we can extend it from our side. and if you look at the ethics of end of life care, um, and think about it, I'm quite sure that I would prefer to be in my own bed, surrounded by my own loved ones, not alone in an ICU where uh, strange masked creatures are doing painful things to me. So if the final hours are properly managed, the family members and the caregivers feel confident. There is a sense of a good death, that whatever happened, well, it was peaceful. And for us, remember that a well managed death is a learning experience, and we also feel blessed at having participated, uh, literally in handing over to the other side with grace and dignity. If we do not do this, then the patient ends up with needless suffering. But the family members live with frustration, worry, and guilt. And this opportunity for growth for us is lost. So, Ramesh has died. And, well, we are moving into the last phase. His family have expressed their thanks that he was not really alone. He did not suffer too long because it just took a couple of days. And they found that even though he could not respond much, he did seem to look at their faces. He did seem to show some expressions, and they found that very helpful. You are doing a home visit. If you are obviously a primary, doctor in the vicinity, you may be able to do it face to face, but otherwise by telephone. And the most important thing that bothers the family is that the funeral was not the way they would have wanted. In almost all cultures, preparing the body, laying it out, is a ceremonial affair which takes hours and sometimes days. The funeral rites take their own time, and all of these are ways for the grief to be worked out. What happens here with Ramesh? Our neighbors don't even greet us anymore, and we have lost the head of our family. How will we ever be at peace? How will you respond to this? Can I ask Rajam and Jennifer to come in? Jennifer, are you audible? Yeah.
Nikhil has responded saying they've had 2 retroviral disease patients who came critical and died due to PCP pneumonia, and landed up with, it was very sad only to hear fear of coming to the hospital. So this was actually an earlier point which they said about bringing home and patients not reporting to the doctors, as well as non-COVID patients fear to come to the hospitals. So completing that, and just to take from where Dr. Roop left about the closure, the ceremonies, like how in the Indian scriptures there's detailed 13-day ceremonies which take place so that the family can have a closure, the ceremonies and the religious activities done on the body which can actually bring the family to accept the fact that this person is no longer alive. So these things do help, and that has completely changed in this. Like somebody else also previously mentioned about receiving the urn by never able to say a goodbye. So these things are going to now be the fallout of this pandemic, and I suppose we will see more and more of this complicated grief and bereavement process. Dr. Jennifer, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we probably need to assume that deaths during this time, the families are going to have complicated grief. Even if they've died of a non-COVID illness, which will relatives, family coming to support is not there. So most of them are going to have complicated grief. I think palliative care and doctors who want to practice the principles and ethos of palliative care should know that palliative care extends through bereavement. And so our role does not end once the patient dies. So how we can continue to support them as teams, as individuals, you can make telephonic conversations, you can have video talks with the family if you've known them. The other thing is if support groups, I don't know how it will work in your context, but people, families who've gone through similar situations and experiences, maybe the right people to support one another.
So a quick question for to be put up in the chat group, and you can say yes or no. Do you have a practice of connecting with the families of patients who pass on? Do you reach out to them after the patient has passed? I mean, those of you who are attending this course, most of you are not from the palliative care field. So do you make this a practice? Do you do this routinely?
So Marianne has actually responded by saying whatever we are able to do, we do, validate their concerns and feelings, and also explain to them that it is not a usual situation. So try and support them as much as they can. And Deepak has written that we will see the fallout of people not being able to access. These are of course for non-COVID times. Marianne has also written that community education of not having stigma on positive patients is important, because at least then there could be a line of communication open with your relatives and people around you geographically.
Yes, but still, if somebody can still tell me, do they make it a point?
So again, I think Marianne from Philippines has written, I keep in touch with parents of my patients who died and offer the prayers.
Yeah. So I think this is something that more of us need to make a practice of. Anyway, moving back to COVID, well, lockdown is increasing, the numbers of people affected is increasing, and it is not just this personal loss. There are other losses. There is financial impact. In India, you had the whole migrant story of businesses closing down, people who could not get healthcare, and you see a lot of anger and resentment, but you also witness many acts of compassion and kindness. And again, you ask yourself, how do I make sense of what has hit all of us? So remember that grief is a total human experience. It's obviously emotional, but it is also cognitive. It is physical. It can actually impact the way you walk, the way you talk to people. It can be spiritual, because you may wonder, how does a maker do all of this? It is social, partly because of isolation, but so many other factors. And in the pandemic, it has been complicated because of the changes in the traditional societal mourning processes, which we've already been through. So I'm closing now. The take-home messages are that we have to shift focus from cure to care, and that means focusing on comfort of the patient. You have to see that the treatment is appropriate, and we don't say right or wrong treatment, we say appropriate treatment, because what is appropriate for one person in a certain situation may not be appropriate for the same treatment, may not be appropriate for another patient in a different situation. If the interventions that you're carrying out, especially those that are not for management of symptoms, are futile, then they must just be stopped. So, for instance, there is no need for giving drugs like statins and aspirin and so on, the kind of drugs that Ramesh would normally have been taking for a long time before he came into the COVID ward. Communication is important, because that is what binds all of this together. And never forget that it is a family who is also partaking in all of this. And you must make a commitment to them that in a way, they are as much your responsibility as the patient is. And that kind of statement goes a long way.
So Nikhil, just a minute, Roop. Nikhil actually points out by saying that being in touch with the family in the bereavement is not a regular practice, because also probably it's a busy practice. If you think of a doctor in the ward of a public hospital, it's very, very difficult to have that. But sometimes they meet the relatives, sometimes the family calls them later to thank them, and that's the time they can touch base. Or the family sometimes, if you've done a lot, actually invite you for a ceremony where they are remembering the person who has died. So it might not be possible, I agree, but in whatever gesture and communication we do with the patient and the family, the compassion, empathy, the kindness has to come through, because we are all going through this difficult time and it's going to be here for a while. So I think it's important more than ever to show that compassion and empathy. You might not be able to do all, but I think the person in front realizes from where you come, and that makes all the difference. And I think that is what is important, where they said that it's still not a part of the medical training, but I think hospice team offers it to patients and families referred to them. So it's Marianne says she advocates and teaches her residents, but still a long way to go. And it's the same Marianne everywhere. So I think it's important for us to realize where we can fill in the loops and see to it that the whole care experience can be offer a little bit of comfort for our patients and their family. Dr. Jennifer, you want to add something?
Yeah, nothing specific.
If I may add one thing, I came across a very profound statement recently where we were trying to disentangle what grief looks like traditionally and what grief looks like now. And what we came across was this line that said, the hardest kind of grief to process is that of the disappeared. And what's happening with people today is that they're disappearing from our lives without us having a chance to even see them or say goodbye, honor them, thank them, ask for forgiveness. There are so many unclosed loops. And I think just being sensitive to the fact that that is the hardest type of grief to process. I think by somehow connecting the families to the patients to ensure that they don't just disappear from somebody's life, but to know that someone was with them and they were witnessed as they made their exit, I think is something that we can aspire to do.
Okay, so if anybody is interested, the quality of death ranking end of life care across the world, there are two publications. One is 2010, the other is 2015. They are both free on the net. Then, especially for Indians, the terms that are used in limitation of treatment and providing palliative care at the end of life, this is also a document that is free on the net, and it clears up a lot of the confusion that a lot of people have. Disclosure, I was part of one of the authors, so anyway. Then palliative care in COVID-19, the resource toolkit, the ebook, please don't forget to go through it. It's something that you will find of a great deal of use. But as I close, I would like again to reiterate one point, and that is that as medical professionals, we can look ahead, and we have to foresee, we have to foretell, because if we do that right, then it becomes a question of withholding rather than withdrawal. And you will realize that although withholding and withdrawal are ethically, morally, legally, in every way actually equal, they are not emotionally equal. For families, at the end of it, withholding becomes an easier process. Withdrawing, even for doctors, is a much more difficult process. And that is why, if you see Ramesh's journey as we have taken it, our focus has been to explain to you how withholding can be done. Thank you. I'm going to close. Smriti, are you taking over now?
We have.
Or Rajman, yeah, we have a few minutes.
We have a few minutes, so we'll open the floor to our participants.
Yep.
Them to share.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, please.
Wow, lots of chat. Right, Rajam. Jennifer, would you take this on? I mean,
sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize one more aspect on communication. While we were talking about grief, I was thinking what can we do to reduce complicated grief is when the patient is still alive, even right from admission, whether mild or moderate or whatever illness it is, to kind of maintain
your voice is broken. Sorry, Jennifer's connection is.
get the patient to connect to the
Hello. Sorry, Jennifer. Jennifer, turn your video off, I think.
being well. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Am I not audible?
No, it was very, very blurred.
I think it will help if you turn the video off, ma'am.
Moira, you're on mute. You're muted.
Hi, everyone. I think I could hear some of what Jennifer was saying, and I think she was very helpfully reminding us that a lot of our bereavement care starts in the way we actually care for patients before they die. So the way in which we communicate, the way in which we acknowledge some of these difficult issues. So sometimes we think of bereavement care happening after someone has died, and yet a lot of what impacts on bereavement are things that we can address or highlight or support before someone has died. I think that's what Jennifer was saying.
Yes. Smriti?
No, I second that. And I suppose, having these conversations about goals of care, etc. Usually in our system, they're done, when it's really, we're emotionally so distraught. And it not only adds to the emotionality of it or whatever. So we in so many places we're trying to talk about advanced care planning and things, and people haven't been ready to have those conversations. But now COVID has made it quite clear that it's something that that is vital, not just for the well-being of the family or their sense of feeling like they've not been completely helpless in the process, but also for healthcare providers to understand how to navigate these conversations without being too intimidating about it. So that's one thing that's coming to the forefront in a big way, I think, nowadays.
And I also think, just to add to the point and lead us to tomorrow, Smriti, it's also the whole concept of the moral distress that healthcare personnel goes through to decide how to put this patient and how to treat it. It kind of overwhelms the healthcare professional. And that leads us on to tomorrow's important topic of managing distress, not just for the patient, family, but also all of us, and how we can address that. I think all this, what we've learned till now, can help us deal with what we are going to discuss tomorrow better, especially communication and knowing the facts of your ethics and the legal status of the place where you work.
Right. If we are done, 4:10.
Yeah, and we're okay to take a couple of questions, or if anybody would like to share anything. There's been some very heartwarming messages in the chat about music. One died while family was singing, and Nikhil has also talked about it. So thank you, Dr. Roop, Dr. Rajam, Dr. Jennifer, and Dr. Moira for this session, very enriching session, and a tough session for a lot of us because these are not sessions we're usually used to having, and the urgency of the current pandemic really sort of makes it even more vital to have these conversations. And thank you all for participating. We, like Rajam said, tomorrow's session is about making sense of distress. And I'm sure that is going to strike a chord with each and every one of us in this room, because we're going to be talking about the distress faced by not just the families and the patients, but the tremendous distress that healthcare providers are now also experiencing by way of burnout, by way of moral distress, and so many other aspects, vicarious suffering, trauma. So we will be tackling some of those topics tomorrow. And thank you again for a very lively chat interaction. Please go through the session on managing distress. And tomorrow is our last day. So please make the best of your interactions with all our experts. The poll will be up in a moment. Please do fill it in before you check out. And with that, we bring this session to a close. Thank you again. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.